All right, let's get going. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this, well, we've had breakfast sessions already, but this is the first official session of the Sunday. My name is Ella Whelan. I'm the co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival, and really delighted to be chairing this one, Literary Wars, the Betrayal of Rushdie and Artistic Freedom, which is, we always have an arts and culture strand at the Battle, and this we thought would kick it off. You know, what's happened to Salman Rushdie over many years, but particularly in the last few years, not just the physical attack on him, but the aftermath of that is really what I kind of want to think about for this session, which was not only was he brutally stabbed and his life put in extreme danger, but then the lack of solidarity from the art world, the official art world, the silence around his attack, and even the sort of, let's face it, bitchy comments on Twitter from some pretty prominent people in the art world, or articles from people like Bernardine Evaristo, essentially hanging him out to dry, was not quite more shocking than a stab in the eye, but certainly, was revealing of some of the problems in the art world in relation to an unwillingness to stick up for artistic freedom and nervousness about defending people's right to write what they like, make any kind of art that they like. So this is a session kind of mainly on literature, because it seems that from the Kate Clanchy episode to other sort of authors who've either had preemptively their work stopped or sensitivity readers forced on them or any of the like, that there is this issue of defending artistic freedom and a sort of lack of what I perhaps want to get into in this session is whether that's something that's being enforced by publishers or enforced by nervous social media managers within the literature world policing authors, or whether actually authors are doing this themselves as well, and whether this is coming from a kind of a lack of courage within the literature world. So we've got a brilliant panel to walk us through this, and just before I introduce them, I'll alert you to the Arts First podcast, which you'll have little tickets on your seat about. It's a really exciting podcast from the Arts and Society Forum, who we work with at the Academy of Ideas, all about these kinds of issues. So if you enjoy today's debate or anything in the art strand, they cover this, is it fortnightly, monthly, thereabouts, anyway, regularly, and they have some great, they also run events and do debates, but this podcast is an online version of those debates, so please check it out. So our speakers are going to speak for about 5 minutes. They've all got very illustrious, long biographies that I'm going to insult by giving truncated versions now. So first we have Jenny Lindsay. Jenny is a writer, an award-winning performance poet, an essayist, a contributor to The Women Who Wouldn't Wish, who I hope some of you either went up to the stall or went to the session or met yesterday, and the author of Hounded, Women, Harms and the Gender Wars, so coming to this debate from a particular experience of the whole cancel culture issue in the arts. Next we have Joe Nutt, sat next to me here. Joe is an educational consultant. He's the author of author John Donne, the poems and an introduction to Shakespeare's late plays. Joe's someone who's written very often and spoken at the Battle of Ideas about the issue around arts and culture, and particularly education, and how we talk to young people about literature and how to approach literature, but also, from an enjoyment perspective, but also from a sort of serious how to respect the arts perspective. We then have at the end of the table there Jillian Philip. Jillian's a writer and a haulage worker, and someone who became an inspiration to many on social media by her defiance around challenging the issue of cancel culture in the arts. And I'm sure she'll say something about her own personal story, but someone who has fought back against the kind of cancelling of artistic freedom. Next to me sat here is Ralph Leonard. Ralph is an author of a letter on liberty that I commissioned, a very good one that's on sale at the Battle Bookshop. Go get it, called Unshackling Intimacy, which is all about intimacy and sex and relationships and humanity. It's a wonderful one. He's a contributor to Unheard, to Quillette, to The New Statesman and Sublation magazine, and writes a lot about these issues wonderfully. I love Ralph's writing, so check him out. And then last but not least, we have Martin Robinson here at the end of the table. He's the director of Trivium 21C Limited. He's an education consultant. He's the author of Trivium 21C, Curriculum Revolutions and Curriculum Athena versus the Machine. Again, somebody who has been writing for a very long time and in the trenches of working around the arts and education and, you know, the whole world of what's going on in relation to artistic freedom. So can we please welcome our panel? And Jenny, your opening thoughts.
Yes. Well, first, thanks very much for having me. I am indeed going to be speaking from the point of view of someone who has been working and living in Scotland forever, but particularly for the last 10 years. I've worked as a poet, a poetry educator, as a live literature programmer, so I've always been 100% freelance for the last 10 years, working across loads of different aspects of the literary arts, the theatrical arts, festivals, books, and all of the rest of it. Over the last 10 years, I've watched very slowly as first principles stuff has been undermined at all levels of the literary arts in Scotland. And Scotland offers a really useful microcosm for how things can go awfully wrong when you've got a very incestuous political culture intertwined with the cultural landscape too. Those of you who have visited the Edinburgh International Book Festival will know that Nicola Sturgeon does chair, for example. Questioning the chief mammy has got people into lots and lots of trouble over the last 10 years. But to return to first principles stuff, there is simply no way to be a writer of anything. Creative writing, theatre, plays, poetry, performance poetry. Now, don't judge me. Performance poetry can be really good, all right? All right. I worked really hard to make performance poetry cool, right? So give me a break. Anyway, there's no point in doing any of that unless you're going to commit to first principle stuff, which is freedom of expression. When you've got huge cultural schisms happening, for example, in Scotland, as we have had over gender identity, over the GRR reform, you have to, if you're a writer, look at these complex things that are causing a lot of people to go, slightly mad at each other, and be willing to courageously look at them and work out what's happening. There is no point being a writer or an artist and turning away from complex social and cultural schisms. I didn't leave, for example, I was a high school teacher at one point. I did not leave one of the last jobs in the Western world that gives you a pension in order to compromise on my freedom of speech. Unfortunately, a lot of my former friends and colleagues have. They have looked at these issues that are causing so many political storms and said, I want to run away from that. And I'm going to turn away not just from the issue itself, but I'm going to turn away from violence against women who are willing to speak about it. I'm going to turn away when people are attacked and are written. The new literary art form that is growing in Scotland, the open letter. It's got very specific sort of little patterns that you can notice. I've in my book Hounded Women Harms and the Gender Wars, I've done a comparative analysis of quite a few of them, and they do use a lot of the same language. And actually, the similarities between how a lot of people who are apparently at the top of the literary arts is something I've noticed too. I am bored out of my mind. A lot of people, because they are so scared and they are self-censoring, as Ella said, a lot of the things that are getting written about do tend to follow similar patterns. And this is because to have a healthy literary ecology, you need the writers, okay? So obviously, first principle stuff. You need people actually writing and creating and making interesting work. But then you need curators who are brave and will go, oh, that's interesting. I'm sure our audiences want to hear that. So you also need interested audiences, and audiences who, want to be challenged and who won't sort of use the heckler's veto to shut everything down as well. That's a very important point too. And you also need a sort of a network of, courageous promoters, festivals, all these kind of things, in order for there to be any point at all in, dedicating yourself full time to being a writer or a poet or whatever. You don't do something as mad as dedicate yourself to such a precarious life in order to compromise. I will repeat that again and again and again. And I say this to younger writers that I've mentored. There's no point. Go and retrain as a plumber. Go and work in a garden centre. Do anything else with your life. If you are willing to compromise on freedom of expression, you're not cut out to be a writer. So that is what I would say. I'll just finish up with just one sentence just about the Salman Rushdie. When Salman Rushdie was attacked, Nick Barley of the Edinburgh International Book Festival and then Chair Alan Little both made very big speeches supporting Salman Rushdie. However, you will note, if you're paying attention, that no gender-critical feminist has ever appeared at the Edinburgh International Book Festival since I was there in 2019. So I will finish off there. Thank you very much.
And Joe.
Okay, so nice to meet you all. So I'm going to start by laying my cards on the table as sort of unambiguously as I can. I think free speech is always and everywhere the only thing that stands between ordinary people and tyranny. It's a struggle that never ends as well, because there will always be individual human beings for whom life is never primarily about family, community, or even coexistence, but is entirely and obsessively about forcing their will onto others. And in my lifetime, I've seen the numbers and influence of these people increase exponentially in publishing in the media. Now, in my professional life, as an author myself and a lead writer for dozens of businesses and NGOs, I've had to spend hours, countless hours, reading all sorts of research. Everything from work by Milton scholars, and trust me, there is no scholar like a Milton scholar, and the kind of fraudulent research that the Institute for Fiscal Studies have so recently been pilloried for producing on VAT in private schools. Now, that experience has convinced me that well over 75% of everything that comes under that title research is merely politicised lobbying. That's all it is. So over many years, instead of trusting the research, I've actually become a great fan of the anecdote. I don't buy into the data delusion because I've worked in technology sales for too long, and I know exactly how Silicon Valley sales reps work with naive politicians. So for me, anecdotes are special because they deliver an extraordinarily precise, real-world, uncomplicated insight. So I'm going to share 3 little free speech insights with you. I visited the collapsing Soviet Union twice. The first time, I met a professor of English from Moscow University who came to the UK shortly after. She had never left the Soviet Union in her life. She's a middle-aged woman. She spoke beautifully, impeccable English, like Sylvia Peters for those of you who are retirees. Okay, I met her at East Midlands Airport and took her to her university. We chatted in the car on the way. On the verge of tears, she said to me she had never in her entire life had a conversation like that, even with a friend in a car. On my second visit to the Soviet Union, our guide took us to St. Petersburg to ride the underground. By the way, the underground in St. Petersburg is something else. When I got onto the top of the long escalator, it was so crowded. And as it went down, I've never seen anything like it, and I travelled on the Waterloo and City line every day for 10 years. As it got to the bottom, I couldn't see anywhere to step off onto the platform. How on earth I survived that? Anybody survives that every day, I don't know. I said to our guide, look, it only takes one person to fall over on the escalator and hundreds of people are crushed. And she looked at me and she didn't blink an eyelid, and she said, yes, but we'd never hear about it. Now, I've published a number of essays about the weaponisation of language in a variety of magazines, including a long essay on Milton's Areopagitica, and I've even done a BBC Radio 4 programme about it. I think so much of the discussion about free speech takes place way downstream from where it matters. Activists and progressives have been taught by sociolinguists in school and university that the English language is simply a bendy toy. Words are entirely flexible things, and therefore they are perfect weapons in political and cultural causes. Want to argue that men can change sex? Just coin the word transphobia. Want to hide your horrific anti-Semitism behind a screen of acceptability? Just coin the word Islamophobia. I've actually been cheered recently because I've seen a dramatic surge in other writers saying the same thing. The single phrase which has cast a spotlight on this is, of course, assisted dying. More and more people are calling it out for the deceitful, deliberately manipulative euphemism it really is. So what I want people to do is routinely and constantly challenge this deceitful wordplay. What the sociolinguists never, ever tell the children they can, when they make up any word they like, or they put any sequence of words on a page and they tell them it's a lovely poem, darling, is they never tell them that people are free to reject their wordplay. Instead of letting the sociolinguists the BBC loves to field have it all their own way, we need teachers, above all, to assert that if the English language doesn't have integrity, it's worthless. And to reiterate my point that this struggle is timeless, I'm going to finish with a quotation from Milton, perhaps the most intelligent author and writer to have ever dedicated time to this vital issue of free speech. Milton said, "When language in common use in any country becomes irregular and depraved, it is followed by their ruin and degradation. For what do terms used without skill or meaning, which are at once corrupt and misapplied, denote, but a people listless, supine, and ripe for servitude?" Be in no doubt we're living through such times. And just one more Soviet anecdote. One of the students I met in Moscow was wearing the most beautiful, bright orange, vivid mittens, furry mittens. And it was minus 25 degrees, the kind of temperature which literally took your breath away if you were a German or French soldier outside Moscow. So I asked her, what was the fur? Holding up both hands with a lovely, proud smile, she said, "That was my cat."
I don't know what to make of that one. Right. Gillian.
Hi. So I'm Jillian Philip. I'm still reeling from the cat story. As Ella said, I was a writer. I was a children's writer. I now work in the haulage industry for the very reason that having been a children's writer, I was cancelled in 2020. It was a 24-hour mob on Twitter, now X, and my employers just collapsed in front of it and instantly fired me kind of within 24 hours. That's my story in brief. Should you wish to read the longer version, it's available in a book called The Women Who Wouldn't Wished, available at the bookstore. Just a quick plug. Now, I think there may have been signs earlier, but I think that I trace personally the current situation in the literary arts back to the fatwa on Salman Rushdie in the late 80s. I mean, 1989, when it was issued, I was fresh out of university, fresh out of a politics degree, and I was extremely complacent about secular liberal democracy. I was very complacent about, as you say, we took it all for granted, and everyone takes it for granted in every generation. The freedom to create, the freedom to write, and the freedom to actually think, which is, even the freedom to think is restricted when you can't express it. So the fatwa came as a shock to me, but not half as much of a shock as the reactions of some people in the publishing industry. Notably Roald Dahl and, amazingly, John le Carré, who did later apologise to Salman Rushdie, which is reassuring. And he said, "I don't think it is given to any of us to be impertinent to great religions with impunity." And I think it is given to all of us, frankly. Robert, I kind of don't like taking his name in vain, given where we are, but Robert Runcie, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, demanded the extension of the Blasphemy Act to cover other religions. So every single writer in the wake of that fatwa, every single publishing professional, every single cleric should have been uncompromising. This isn't on. This is not what we do here. But they weren't, and that was it was a disappointment, and I got an even bigger shock in 2007. Some of you might remember the infamous Question Time performance by Shirley Williams, a Liberal Democrat, after Salman Rushdie got his knighthood, who said, and she was asked, about the knighthood, she said, "I think it was a mistake. I think the timing's very odd indeed. This is a man who has deeply offended Muslims in a very powerful way, who's been protected by the British police for years and years at great expense to the taxpayer, and it was not wise and not very clever to give him a knighthood. And famously, Christopher Hitchens waited for the applause to die down and said, I think that's a contemptible statement, and I think everyone who applauded it should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves. And I think I was sitting actually applauding at the TV. But I did bring the whole Rushdie affair up last night, in fact, with a publishing friend. Yes, I do remember some of last night. Now, she's been working in the publishing industry for decades. She actually entered it in 1988, which was the year that The Satanic Verses was published, coincidentally. And I was talking to her last night about this reaction of the publishing industry and the creative industry to the Rushdie affair. She actually corrected me, and she said, every single young publishing professional that she knew in the industry at that point stood 100% by Rushdie. They protested in his behalf, and they were vociferous in his defence. Now, can you imagine if it happened today? That situation would be completely flipped. It would be completely flipped. The young publishing professionals, because it's the young professionals in publishing, and some senior professionals, to be fair, they've helped cement this climate of, call it nervousness mildly, because when I say nervousness, I mean that the big publishing firms are all in terrified thrall to their junior staff. And I don't know why they're such cowards, because like publishing is notoriously an extremely popular industry, a lot of people wanting to get into it, there's plenty of competition, so I don't know why they can't just say you're not cut out for publishing, right? So, and social, but they don't, they just carry on with it. Social media as well in the last 20 years, 10 or 20 years, blindsided the publishing industry. And if they'd stood up to the first social media mob, it would never have got this far, but they didn't. And it's because it's been increasing and increasing since the Rushdie affair, they just cave. They just cave. They don't want to cause offence. So now we've got a publishing industry that's throttled by the sensitivity readers, by book bloggers who create storms around books, and worse, by, as we've all said, self-censorship. You know, no writer starting out would dare to challenge the sensitivity readers, because writers do it themselves. And the worst of it is, of course, that writers are afraid to think, let alone speak. And I'll finish with, I was on a panel with the poet Maggie Gibson later last year, and she said, it's the cancellation of ideas. You can't formulate an idea if you're not allowed to think, and they are afraid to think, let alone speak, because if they thought about some of the things they're enabling, they wouldn't be able to live with themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you. In a recent speech at Vanderbilt University's Global Free Speech Summit in Nashville, Salman Rushdie himself said that it would be more difficult to publish the Satanic Verses in today's climate than in that of 1988. Is he not right? It would be hard to imagine a prominent author of whatever background would have the temerity to use the Holy Writ of Islam for literary and satirical purposes, as Rushdie did in the Satanic Verses. It is barely imaginable to find a writer who would think of writing such a thing, let alone it being published. It's not that there is a law that says that it is, so to speak, haram to write such a thing, but it's virtually a fact that you won't get published by one of the big publishing houses that gatekeep the literary scene if you do. And it's the same case for other very contentious issues. Could you imagine a prominent author writing a story about a transgender person who transitioned but then detransitioned? It's not that it could be the best book ever written. It could have the best mastery of the English language. It doesn't even matter what the reasoning is for the so-called detransition, but you will not find that story ever written because there is just a silent, taboo that you just don't write that sort of thing if you want to get published by a big mainstream publishing house. But I want to emphasize something a little bit different, that of authorial freedom, that is the freedom of the writer. Because as someone who is a writer, though on non-fiction than fiction, being a writer isn't a vocation or a job or a career or a hobby, but it's what I am. And in that sense that it really matters to me that, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution is me. That is what I am. And thus, it's an inevitable concomitant of literature that there will be books that upset or offend certain readers. It would be surprising if that were otherwise the case. The world is an upsetting place in many regards, so writers will inevitably reflect that in their work. That is, if literature wishes to claim to reflect the world that we live in. T.S. Eliot once said that humanity can't bear much of reality. He is, in a sense, vindicated. We don't often want to be reminded of the harsh truths of existence or history, or be exposed to perspectives and ways of seeing the world that discomfort us. Novels that frankly portray racism and oppression, like Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, have been on the ends of efforts of surreptitious censorship to, if you will, circumcise the language of it to make it more acceptable for current day readers. But this is a travesty, because part of the power of that book is precisely the fact that it does discomfort us, that it exposes us to that reality that slavery and racialized slavery was a thing, and it is part of our history, whether we like it or not. And thus, the limits of authorial freedom today is often based on identity and perspective, that of standpoint epistemology. This is why some of the defense of Rushdie at the time was a little bit hypocritical. It was that, well, it's okay for Rushdie to write satanic verses because he comes from a Muslim background and that's his culture. But what if Rushdie was a non-Muslim and was on the end of that fatwa? I very much doubt that the defense that he got at the time would be as strong as it was from those that did defend him at the time. But this emphasis on identity goes against the spirit of being a writer. The writer, at least of fiction, is almost by definition an outsider who inhabits the lives and experiences of others, those who are very much not like him or herself. This is valuable as an outsider can see things as that an insider doesn't. This is the basis of imagination, of what makes fiction worth reading, that through inhabiting these different characters, we can arrive at a more universal conversation, what it means to be human. We have become so caught up with identity, not content. A writer, at least a good and perceptive one at least, should be able to momentarily rise above the boundaries of their own identity and history and experience, and write with freedom about the full, intricate range of the human condition. We shouldn't degenerate back into a position where people are silenced and suppressed because they are simply from the wrong place. Edward Said, in his defense of Rushdie against the odious fatwa of Khomeini, said that the cause of defending Rushdie was like taking up an intifada of the imagination. And I propose that it is this intifada that needs to be carried up again until victory.
And Martin.
Right, I'm going to move into the world of education, I'm afraid, but particularly banning and cancelling that goes on in education. And starting with the premise that, for me, education is for freedom of thought, and as Augustine said, freedom from the teacher and the parent, perhaps. So we're starting a school library, and the movement, I think you sort of touched on there, to ban books from school libraries. And more than 50% of requests to ban books from school libraries in this country come from parents. In the US, it is similar, and a lot of it in the US comes from the religious right.
But there's also, of course, a worrying trend, not only from religious communities, but from the right and the left as well, to ban books, whether it be Lord of the Flies, To Kill a Mockingbird, Huckleberry Finn, etc. Not only that, we also move into what is taught in the classroom. We have another worrying trend to cancel lessons, resources, and even teachers. And teachers are under scrutiny as never before, whether it be management wanting to script their lessons or pupils filming their teachers being woke and putting it out on the TikTok or whatever it's called. Targeting their teachers undermines the teacher authority and the school's authority, and leading to one example in a Kent school, to the school being emergency Ofsteded to make sure the rest of the staff weren't woke. And in the most egregious example, a Batley Grammar School teacher still in hiding, apparently suffering from PTSD because of a parental campaign against the RE lesson he taught, in which he played devil's advocate, showing a cartoon of Muhammad. And it is shocking sometimes to see many of the same voices advocating free speech, supporting Rushdie, etc., then campaigning on social media and other places against the right of teachers to use their professional judgment and what to teach and how to teach it, as well as what books should be stocked in school libraries, where the school's librarian, if the school is lucky enough to have a school librarian, let alone these days a library, again, they should be trusted to do their jobs too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, let's see some hands, and we'll take a bunch of contributions from the floor, and then we'll come back to our panel. Do we have handheld microphones in here or not? No? Okay, fine, that's fine. It's a small room, we can shout. So let's start right at the back. If you stand up and use a loud voice, that'd be good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was wondering how much freedom of literary expression is affected by increasing concentration in the publishing industry. I know this is not a talking point that normally is brought up these days today, but obviously if there are like 5 or 6 major publishing houses and the numbers seem to be decreasing all the time, and similarly, like, there are 2 main book retailers. One thing that was not discussed is like the idea of Amazon removing books from the website. That these things as well would contribute potentially even in terms of the level of reducing choke points, and also having to deal with companies that, who knows, maybe they have some division, say in like China, or a division with dealing with some other industrial part of that conglomerate, that you wouldn't want to touch certain subjects because it would adversely impact their other financial interests.
Thank you very much. Let's see hands. Yep.
Yeah, I think it's really important to bring up the point about the Soviet Union and the East European bloc, because what's forgotten is that censorship, even in the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc and communist countries, is most of it was not directly by the state, but it was by publishing companies and so on. You know, the cultural circles and so on. Because what I find in discussions with say students and so on, they are against state censorship, but they do not understand the history of censorship. That much of it has been self-censorship, social censorship, not simply state, although the two can go together. And that they've forgotten the lessons of the 20th century, was that writers of the 20th century were much more conscious of, who had experienced both censorship from tradition, from the right, from the church and so on, as well as censorship from their own side. Many writers were intellectuals of the 20th century, were left-wing. They'd experienced both, and therefore valued freedom of expression. And I think, just coming to the Salman Rushdie, you know, the Satanic Verses was not simply about a relationship to Islam. It was a relationship to the Milton tradition through the Romantics, and to deny Salman Rushdie his freedom of expression to write a book on satanic verses is to deny his relationship to the Romantic writers who also wrote their satanic verses, of Byron, of Shelley, and so on. So I think, you know, that point about universalism in freedom of expression and challenging whether it's left or right is really, really important.
Thank you.
Just wonderful contributions here, and not very difficult to disagree with. But just to extend, obviously, the controversy about Salman Rushdie and the satanic verses, and I was around at that time. I read the book in '89 and studied. But also there's another author who's not a Muslim background, Michel Houellebecq, who's a French novelist who wrote a book called Submission in 2015. He's quite a controversial writer, not a feminist, you know, kind of do hold the red cross against him, and he's very explicit. And what, you know, the Prime Minister of France at the time, in 2015, when Submission came out, it was a best-selling novel. It's a kind of dystopian novel about an Islamic party winning an election in France, and the kind of Islamization of Europe. So the French Prime Minister said, France is not Michel Houellebecq. It's not intolerance, hatred, or fear. So, you know, my question is, as objectionable as some people may find Michel Houellebecq, and there's plenty to find objectionable in him, would you defend him if his life was threatened?
Thank you. And at the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to put something else into the equation here, which is workplace activism. I came in late, so I just heard the word open letter, just as I was coming in. I was just kind of thinking, one of the reasons I think that particularly kind of young staffers in the publishing industry have this perceived power is because they have this kind of power of affiliation, using these kind of tactics, the kind of internal boycott, the kind of wildcat strike. These are all kind of industrial relations type things, whereby groups of people can come together in very kind of fluid and flexible ways. They can put pressure in certain places. They can intimidate staff within organisations. They can make themselves visible en masse to bosses. And, you know, it's a really interesting kind of mixture of things here between the attention economy, what you might kind of call kind of consumer logic, bringing people together in swarms, but also behind it is this kind of left-wing ethos of kind of progressivism, but also kind of economic justice at work. So it's like a really interesting kind of hybrid. So I just thought I'd put that into the mix.
Brilliant, thanks. Pan, I'll take one more and then I'll come back out down here.
It's just about the interplay, I suppose, with schools and publishing and literature, and going back again to the Soviet Union, as Lady Hein said, that culture was used to enforce ideas. So I suppose the issue with schools is when you have politics influencing publishing, and when you have politics influencing teachers. We know in Scotland we have lobby groups going in and training teachers and telling them what material is appropriate to use in schools. Then the problem starts to be that people stop trusting those teachers because they don't trust what is coming down to them from culture and from publishing, because we know about the problem in publishing and censorship.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, panel, just you can't answer everything and just pick up on something, but in particular I'm interested in this idea that Vanessa and others raised about, you know, the thing about the literary wars and censorship in literature is that it's, you know, in the middle of the 1900s, or, you know, in previous periods of history, it was very much state or church censorship. It was clearly top down in most cases, and that doesn't really, that very, very rarely happens anymore. It's now very much more, you know, someone writes a review on Goodreads about Kate Clancy's book, and instead of saying, okay, we don't care, a publisher goes into meltdown and suddenly things are banned. So it's, you know, where is the pressure coming from? and how do you solve it? Because obviously if it's state censorship, it's kind of easy to solve. In a way, it's easy to solve it because you just say the government shouldn't do that. But if there's sort of multiple pressures happening, you can't pass a law to say you must publish this. You know, how do we work that? Let's just start with Martin and work our way along the table, and we'll do the reverse next time. Sorry, Martin.
I'll take up a couple of points, I think. The one about the publishing industry and narrowing down, and the monopolisation of book distribution as well, perhaps. And because I'm trying to write a fiction book, which is scary because I've been trying for a long time. But I went on a course to help me, and it went very well, by the way, so it's looking good. But anyway, the person taking that course warned me, and he said, the trouble with the publishing industry is it's very North London and very female and very woke, therefore, you know. So you've got to take that into account. These are the people who will get the first read of what you're writing. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, whether it's just his anecdote, you know, but that was his experience writing a book nowadays. Now, whether it's true or not, I can't say. The Kate Clancy book, I think, is a really interesting example of that world not realising what it's reading, and then Philip Pullman, etc., saying how wonderful. Mind you, when you do a review of a book, you hardly ever read the book. But anyway, I think he might have been caught up by that. But there he is, saying what a wonderful book it was. Then slowly it ekes out that there are problematic statements in this book that even Kate Clancy denied she had made, these, you know, racist comments. I didn't say that. And then she realised, oh, I did actually write that, but I didn't mean it. And this world not being able to necessarily, therefore, see its shared guilt, if you like, didn't notice it until it was pointed out to it, and then there's a collective meltdown and panic, I think. And I think that was an example of panic. Though I do think there is a role for books to be changed over time. And I think if there's a certain Agatha Christie book that was on sale now with 10 little whatevers, it might not sell so well. You know, so I think there are issues to be talked about. Teachers and pressure upon teachers. What teachers, are they all sort of completely like something? The vast majority of teachers, and I mean the vast majority of teachers, try and teach along with DFE guidelines, which is to represent sides. And if you take just part of what they're saying and bung it on TikTok, one of those sides can look terrible and lead to part of the moral panic there is about teachers and feed into that. And I think there might be teachers teaching out there, but I think the vast majority of them aren't teaching one thing, trying to brainwash your kids. And even over a whole school, there is likely to be difference in what is being taught and viewpoints. So I think it's very unfair to pick out on teachers and say, oh, they're completely brainwashed by lobby groups, by politicians saying this, that and the other. They're brainwashing our kids, take our kids out and home educate. I think that, you know, it can get to a ridiculous point. And I think teachers I would ban all filming teachers in schools, ban mobile phones. That's something that should be banned, because I think it's getting to a ridiculous point and completely undermining not only what is taught, but how it is taught.
Thanks, Martin. Rab?
As for the Michel Houellebecq question, then yeah, absolutely, I'll defend him, because one, it's a question of self-interest. If I don't defend him, who's going to defend me? And also, secondly, it's also just the principle of defending the idea of the written word, that, you know, sometimes we can kind of kind of judge books on, like, the politics of the author or the sort of ideology of the author, but not so much on the literary and aesthetic quality of the work. So, you know, someone who has bad politics can write a book that also has bad politics, but its literary and aesthetic quality can be of a very high level that you can't ignore it when talking about, you know, this issue or that issue, or how, you know, of the books that have been written about this issue. So that's the first thing. And on the question about the monopolization or like the concentration of publishing houses, that I think that one danger of that is that the books that come out are of a very standardized quality, that they all kind of say more or less the same thing, or more or less project more or less the same kind of worldview. You know, a kind of, some people call this woke, but, you know, a kind of left, liberal kind of worldview. And that also, you know, because we always make this virtue about diversity, but then obviously having books that have a very homogenizing worldview is a big contradiction, and that's a problem we have to discuss as well.
Brilliant, thanks. Joe?
I think it's a really important thing to understand the nature of the publishing industry, especially in the UK. So my last, the book I wrote called The Point of Poetry, the marketing manager of the publishers, I've written 5 books for 3 different publishers. And the marketing manager said, you must go to the booksellers' main conference of that year. And I did. And don't misread what I'm saying. I'm just telling you what it was like. This is the only conference I've ever been to where I was easily in a staggering minority as a man. Staggering. I mean staggering. That's one thing. The second thing is this. So the best thing I've ever written and will ever write will never get published. And I know this because I wrote it when my eldest daughter set off for university. I wrote a series of essays for my 2 daughters, about from dad to his daughters. I could got a whole file full of lovely complimentary things from agents in New York, in London, top agents, publishers, beautifully written, you're a talented author. And I gave up because I received this email from a top agent, and she said, roughly this, she said, it's absolutely beautifully written, I loved it, and I could sell it tomorrow if you were a celebrity. But because you aren't, I know I can't. And at that point, I just went, there you go, Joe, don't try selling that. That is the publishing world. That's the media world. That's what they don't care about quality writing. They're not interested in They're not interested in talent. They're not. They have to sell something, and they know they have to sell something. That's why I'd say just one last thing very quickly. If you are an aspiring writer, your role model should be Elena Ferrante. I absolutely love Elena Ferrante's writing, and I love it because I have no idea who the hell she is. And she's clever. She's really clever that she made that decision to hide her identity.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jo. Jenny?
I think that was really interesting points. I need to think about them a wee bit longer to respond to them. The first thing I wanted to say was just in the interest of Kate Clancy. On Monday night, I had my book launch at the Hippodrome with the Free Speech Union, and Kate Clancy was a guest. And she, I would say, being cancelled as a writer is a really complicated process. It's not a case of some people say some nasty tweets and you lose your livelihood. It's what I call an anatomy of a hounding. And Kate did a presentation that was it outlined one of the most brutal professional assassinations I have ever seen. It was not a case of Kate didn't realise she'd used some bad words. It was a case of Kate had her entire character assassinated by not just fellow writers, but by people behind the scenes. And it was recorded, and I would urge everybody to go and look at that and analyse just how these things happen. My own cancellation in the Scottish Literary Arts was what I called an anatomy of a hounding. Many people are involved. It's fellow writers, it's other people, all of the rest of it. I would just urge people to not brush off the very human cost of these types of cancellations. And what Kate has been put through is, I would say, one of the most brutal examples of a literary assassination I've ever seen. So just wanted to make that point. The second thing I want to make is to address sort of sector issues and all of the rest of it. I suppose I'm really lucky because I've come at this from I was a self-taught poet. I was just scrappy. I set up some really good events. I managed to wheedle my way into festivals and get commissions and all that kind of thing. I studied politics, not English lit. I don't have an agent. And when I was cancelled from the poetry world, what my cancellors did not know is that I could write prose. Yay! So I moved into writing prose and essays. I wrote, forgive me, I know I'm Scottish, I'm not supposed to like myself, but I did write a good essay about my own hounding, and that got me picked up by Polity, and I was approached by Polity Books, which is really rare. But I would say that I wouldn't have been approached had it not been for the likes of Kathleen Stock and Helen Joyce and all the other writers who've gone before me who've addressed the gender wars, because Polity looked around and went, there's something kind of crazy happening that we don't think the public like, which is women getting their lives destroyed by cultural authoritarians. Let's look for somebody who that's completely happened to, and I'm afraid it has. I did lose my entire livelihood, and so Hounded, Women Harms and the Gender Wars was born. Now, I do have friends who are still in the literary world who are not involved in the gender wars, who are probably a bit scared to say, Jenny's my friend. And one of them is a writer of fiction, and I'm going to try and use gender-neutral pronouns. Oh, no, it won't work. Anyway, they're agents, so they've written this beautiful fiction book that I think is wonderful. I was very lucky to be the first reader on, but it has a character in it that is a sympathetic turban character, which I thought was genius. I was like, that's brilliant. You'll have loads of women who are just like, oh yeah, brilliant. There's a sympathetic TERF character who does like brilliant things in this book. And his agent said, no, I'm never ever going to even try and sell that. So he stopped writing it. Whereas I would have gone, sack your agent and just go and self-publish it in Substack. He's gone, well, I'm in that world with a big five. And so it is, I do have a sort of very scrappy outsider's viewpoint of this. So if you do want to, get the nice sofas and make a living out of writing, maybe don't listen to me. But if you want to have integrity, do. Right.
Just following on from what Jenny was saying there about the actual hounding and how kind of psychologically destructive it is, what I usually say at these events is that there's no point resenting a Twitter mob because Twitter mobs are anonymous. They're kind of a blob, a kind of force of nature that just comes together. There is no fighting them. They're like scorpions. Scorpions are going to scorpion. It's the publishers and the big corporations and the big charities and so on that should be resisting that. So if the publishers and corporations had more guts, Twitter mobs wouldn't be a problem, as I say. However, there is also this issue of, in publishing, people within publishing who have great influence. I mean, I was really I tweeted a lot about the gender wars 3 years before I was cancelled. But the one that really got to me was Rachel Rooney, her cancellation. Now, she's an amazing children's author and poet. She'd written a beautiful little book, My Body Is Me. It was very body positive. It was diverse. It was inclusive. It was the most beautiful book. And she was cancelled and driven out of the publishing industry. She simply couldn't bear to do it anymore because of a clique of really quite well-known children's authors. Now, that's who should be held to account for a lot of this, because the blob of the Twitter mob wouldn't have nearly as much power if there weren't these dreadful people actually writing for children, I ask you, in the publish and bad writers, by the way. Quite a lot of them. Just to cover a couple of other things, the whole thing about the monopoly of Amazon and everything, I think we focus almost... I know it's easy to say we focus too much on the big five. There are great independents, and we should all be kind of going more towards the independents. They're much more adventurous, and it's easy to say that because they don't have the marketing budget, I know, and everything, but they're fabulous people like Eye Enlightening Books, just as one example. And they've published some fantastic books, and beautifully presented. Again, Michelle Welbeck, that issue, yes, absolutely. I had a note here that even books are contentious, wrong, offensive, I don't know, whatever, especially those books should be defended. Their publication should be defended, because we have to be able to defend everything people say, not just the things we believe in. And the last thing I want to say about the consequence culture thing, like the social consequences, social censorship, if I see one more account on X, formerly Twitter, saying free speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences, I swear to God, I'll go postal. Yes, it does. That's the whole point. It doesn't mean you're free from argument or opposition or criticism. No, but it means you are free. You shouldn't be losing your job. You shouldn't be losing your freedom, and you shouldn't be losing, you shouldn't be losing your life in some states. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Right, let's head out. I mean, some interesting things that maybe we could just think about in the audience. Martin, you said that you'd be fine with books being changed in some instances, and I want that, which is, how would that work? Is it that an author would have to make a decision, or an author's estate or something, or where are the boundaries that lie in that? Because that instantly I thought, that's a bit nerve-wracking. Who would be doing that? Certainly wouldn't trust lots of publishers to be doing that. But if it's the case that a work of art is being, or a piece of literature is being hampered by something that's, maybe perhaps irrelevant to the whole piece and could just be fixed by this one little vocabulary change, maybe that's worth it. But just, what do people think about that? Because that's an interesting sort of tension. And also, in relation to the freedom from consequences thing, the thing that I have with the literary wars is that we end up potentially talking about what kind of works of fiction should be published that are politicised fiction, or fiction that's about a particular political. So somebody writing a book with a sympathetic TERF character, that might have been a wonderful story, but I really don't want to read fiction just about the gender wars, or just about, I don't know, net zero, or whatever the contentious political issue is that's being banned. I want to, a lot of the time I want to read to escape from the world of politics into something more interesting. And is there a problem with this debate skewing what really we should be talking about in literature, which is, as Ralph alluded to, sort of like great aesthetic works about anything, not just about what's happening in the immediate sort of news cycle or anything else. Okay, let's start down here.
Oh, okay. I think that down that road, Martin, is sorry.
Which road?
The road of actually changing texts. First of all, we have editors. I'm an editor, I'm a critic, so I write for my own stuff and I edit other people's. There's of course a process of editing where sensitivities, concerns the contemporary will modify a text before it's published, because that's what an editor is for. An editor is there to kind of work as the audience before the work becomes the published work for the audience. But to retrospectively start to modify things is, and Roald Dahl is a very good example of this, one of the greatest, most loved children's authors, whatever his background, whatever he thought about Jews or whatever, the fact is he wrote very, very good stories that kids like, because there is threat, risk, irony and fun, right? Something which we're very uncomfortable with now, and which is being slowly taken out, or the last round of re-editions we're taking out all the things that actually kids find fun in Dahl. So I think that's a very, 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 very slippery slope that we should not concede on at all, right? If it's going to be changed, call it a new edition with amendments, right? So that it's clear that this is not what the author intended at the time. Just in terms of Michel Houellebecq, right? Because I think it's a very important point about criticism too here. Michel Houellebecq's Submission is not an anti-Islamist book. It's actually a satire about the moral defeat of French secular politics, right? So this is an important point about reading reviews, reading criticism. It's important to have a plurality of criticism. Lots of people coming up with lots of different versions of their take about what a book is and whether it's good or not. To have only one take on, like the heckler's critic veto on Submission, would be a disaster, and is a disaster, because if you're relying on one person's take on whether a book is good or bad, and if that take is actually, the consequence of that take is to cancel anybody's ability and permission to read that book, that's also a cultural disaster. So as a critic, I'm fundamentally against anybody who says, shut this person down, because it's not about whether the ideas are bad or not in the book, it's about whether I get the right to judge for myself. Yeah. Right? That's nothing to do with the author, that's to do with me.
Okay, thanks. Let's see hands. Yep. Can we stand?
Stand.
Yes. Thank you.
So so I've got three very brief points that are connected. The first point is the discussion of children's literature. I used to love children's literature, and I think one of the reasons why I loved it just as both as a child and an adult is that you feel like the great role of children's literature is to open up the imagination, to sort of like give a sense of the wider world, and to, for children to consider their place in it and how they would act in it. And really good children's literature allows this, freely to happen within the child's mind. And when I go into bookshops now, I tend to avoid the children's literature shelves, because I find I find gut churning, a lot of them, because it just seems like appalling the way children's literature is being used to reshape the child's mind. And I'd quite be interested if any, because I've, on a way, realised I've ignored children's or blocked out children's, I'd be quite interested in whether I'm right, and how bad the problem is. Linked to that, I think, is the thing about language, and kind of why it matters. And I'd be quite interested to hear. I know that there's a big discussion to be had here, but how much does it really matter? And I think it does really matter, but it's like working out how one teases out the arguments, because what is it that language does? Why does it matter that language is being changed or altered or stopped in some kind of way? And I think it is that, it's kind of linked to the children's literature thing, because it is about the development of thought and the willingness to take risks in your own mind. I mean, self-censorship is not necessarily a bad thing. In certain circumstances, it's very important. But if you feel like that is what's dominating your whole life and what you're doing in your life, then basically your mind is being twisted out of shape. It's being prevented from being free and experimental and sort of like exploratory. And so the final thing to that is, why is this happening? And is there a way of pushing back that sort of like, I don't know exactly, but I think one of the problems we face is this thing we've talked about really, certainly among people who've attended the Battle of Ideas for a good number of years, is the problem of victim culture and safetyism, where basically the person who is thinking, or who is being, who is acting, becomes less and less important against the person they're acting or speaking or addressing. So it's almost like you no longer consider yourself and what you think and what you want to say, but you consider who your audience is and how they're going to respond and whether you're going to in some way harm or damage them. And that kind of pressure to do that, I think, is a very dangerous pressure. But I just wonder how much that's a factor, I guess, in the literary world, where it's not just you thinking about your own lives, but also like how much you're just inured to other people's feelings and have to be inured to other people's feelings, or whether there's also that sort of how much you feel the literary world is affected by safetyism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Wendy. Just on children's literature, of which was all I read at the moment, I haven't bought a new book, and I've gone in and tried. I've said, okay, give everyone, but it's always about the green frog who's dying because he lives next to a car park, or it's just, and I can't. It's unbearable for me to read, and so then my son can feel it's unbearable, and no one has fun. But then it doesn't mean that I don't. These things do affect you. You're reading The Tiger Who Came to Tea, and there's no. My husband is reading it, and he's saying, "And there's no food left for Daddy," and I'm thinking, "Frickin' Daddy makes his own food," but so you're not. There's there's a kind of a break between the idea that an adult will read it one way and the child will read it another way, and that's good. That's the part of the enjoyment, and the best writers will have double meanings in it. This is my favourite one, Peace at Last, which is all about a bear who can't sleep, and at the end, I love them.
I can see where it's going.
At the end, the picture in the book, the son who is handing his tired father post, and you can see that it's drawn with HMRC, so there's a joke in that for the adult, and it's brilliant, and it means that when I'm reading it for the 154th time, it's still funny. So there's this, I think, just they're so superficial. That's the problem with children's literature at the moment. It's just one-dimensional. There's nothing in there. Well, there's everything in there for parents in a way, but it's written in a childish way, so no one enjoys it. Anyway, sorry, that's my rant. Okay, there in the middle, stand up.
I wanted to come back to the idea of book bans in education, because I have recently written an article about that issue focused on the US. And it's not just parents asking for books to be removed from libraries. There are state laws that are actually in Utah, there's a list of 13 books that are not allowed to be in schools, and not just elementary schools, it's all schools. And one of the most difficult questions I had to answer when writing this article was, okay, well, those are public schools, so the government is funding it, and in a sense, shouldn't the government be allowed to set its policy on that? Now, I disagree with that, but I would love to hear your guys' answers to that question.
Brilliant, thanks. Yeah, here in the glasses, yeah. Stand up, sorry. Thank you.
I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. I just wanted to check, is there a risk of conflating commercial interest with censorship? Like, I think, obviously, a lot of the ideas that you're talking about, they now fall outside what is politically and culturally dominant, whereas maybe they wouldn't have before. And to me, it makes sense to a certain extent that it is going to be smaller independent publishers that are going to want to take these ideas on so they're commercially viable, because at the end of the day, they are trying to sell their books for profit, and they're trying to give that to audience. So I don't know if that...
No, a brilliant point. What role do readers play, actually, this, and what's the demand? Is there a problem with demand? Yeah, in the cap, yeah.
I'm just wondering, I'm intrigued, I've gone to a number of these events over the years, and with great respect to the people on the panel, particularly people wringing their hands and complaining about the issues. But there seem to be very few people who are willing to step forward and actually organise something and do something that would affect some sort of change, even if they fail. What do the panel think a small organisation would look like that would be effective? Because it seems that people within the publishing industries themselves, they're terrified of doing anything to alienate or argue with the young staff. So what would a new organisation look like and sound like? What would it say? What would it do? Even if it was small in scale, what would that be?
Brilliant, thanks. In the aisle?
There's a couple of things really. I loved all your introductions, and I was particularly interested in this idea of sort of the homogenisation that you get if you're afraid to be brave, just another crap literature. And it made me think about what makes great literature. I read lots of politics and stuff, and I don't want to do the same thing when I'm reading a book. It comes back to what you were saying. And it does take you outside of your experience. It takes you beyond it, and it's some human experience you haven't had. You don't want it just to be reflecting your own experience and your own thoughts back. Otherwise, it's not great, is it? So I thought that was quite important. And then I was thinking, that discomfort I think is important in literature. And I thought, well, how do we overcome that though? And so this is a question for everybody really, because I see this sort of self-censorship coming into I work in academia and I work in engineering, but you get this horrible self-censorship across academia, but you can understand it as well. Think about your experiences, for example, where people do get hounded and cancelled and so on. So I get why people are afraid, and people are afraid to speak out. I'm always speaking out, but most people won't. And I think, how do we overcome that? It's a question for everyone in the room, not just for the panel.
Okay, panel, let me just come back to you. I'm conscious that I want to take a big chunk of questions. So panel, let me just come back to you for literally one thought, 30 seconds a minute, and then we'll come out for a large chunk, get everyone, and then you can have your final thoughts. Let's start with you, Gillian. Just really one thought.
One thought. The thing about the didacticism and sort of oversimplification of children's current writing, there's almost a kind of thing going around, kids are very discerning about what they read, they'll stop reading if it's boring, la la la. But there's a limit to that, because if that's all they're being offered, and what is on the shelves for children at the moment is just, I'm with you, I can't walk into a children's department nowadays because it just looks so damn depressing. The corrections of even the old ones, yes, as you were talking about, the corrections of the old ones, that's kind of like erasing the history. It's like saying that never happened. Nobody ever thought like that. Nobody ever used those words. And that ain't true. So that is also lying to kids. I just look back at, to take two examples, Watership Down and The Wind in the Willows, two of my favourites growing up. There is nothing as kind of elaborate, the beautiful language. It's like they just assume kids are too stupid for something complex and beautiful, basically. And I think that's a big mistake, and I think it may be more commercial, but I think it's ultimately counterproductive because you're not creating customers that you're going to keep.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jenny.
I'll take on the what can we do, what would that look like, what would change look like, and I think you could drive yourself mad trying to reimagine the entire world. So all I can do as an individual writer is do what I've been doing. I knew as soon as I was confronted by gender identity ideology that I didn't just think it was untrue, but I thought it was dangerous. And I thought, well, I'm not going to do that then. I'm going to speak about that and find ways to write about it, and so I did. And that's what I could do. What I can also do as a small events person is I set up a very small organisation in Scotland last year called Platformed, and I booked people that I knew probably weren't going to get booked elsewhere. A really interesting new comedian in Scotland. I gave him his first stand-up gig. It sold out in 24 hours, as did my book launch, which was cool. So what individuals have to do is what you can do. So, I mean, I am somebody who is a skint poet, but with no kids, who works entirely for myself. So what I do is I speak, I write, I put on events, and I come to these things, and I meet cool people like Gillian. And what you can do might be something different. Maybe you can support other people to do that. Maybe you can sign some petitions. But the fact is, if you're not happy with how things are, then don't do them. The whole thing that you were saying about, I had so many people, including like really rich artistic directors of theatres, like in my DMs going, oh, you're very, very brave. I wish I could afford to speak out. And I'm like, dude, I cannot afford to speak out. And I really can't afford for you not to speak out because you're the artistic director of a theatre. Like, come on. You know, so I think people just need to be a little bit braver and stop being so scared of these people. Some of these Twitter mob people are so vicious and vile on Twitter. And then you, like, on this panel, they would be melting like butter and unable to actually articulate their thoughts because all they have is snark and sneer. They don't even know what they're attacking when it comes to the gender wars most of the time. I mean, I see that. So just do what you can. And when people are doing something, support them and don't say, oh, you're not doing enough. Yeah? So that's another thing as well. So, as 4 Women Scotland can attest.
So try and make it really, really quick. 2 points just to hit. One, echo this about the Twitter thing. I wrote an article for the Times Ed about young adult literature, saying how awful it is, and I was on the Today programme. They sent a car for me the next morning to defend myself, but I'm still here, you know. And I had American librarians wanting me hung. So, but the second thing, I think this hits a lot of things. On my way here, I read a lovely essay. I write for a magazine sometimes called The Critic. If you haven't read The Critic, nice magazine, great essay this morning by Jacob Phillips. And he says, I've got, you know, the timing, isn't that typical? It timed out exactly when I said. But just to quote what he said in his essay, which is really nice, this is about how pernicious politics is. And he says, the job of the political sphere is to get out of the way so that people can actually live. Goodness me, isn't he right?
Thanks, Ralph.
On the question of like the audience and demand, I think there's also the fact that, you know, less and less people read for pleasure or to be amused, and that's probably one reason why a lot of people don't get satire, because they don't read they don't read that satire. And that's also, and it's not that I don't think people are now incapable of like reading a good, you know, really complicated or really aesthetically wonderful piece of work. Is that even though we talk about TikTok or Twitter, people only think in tweets or in TikTok clips, but if, as was talked about with children's literature, if what they're reading at a young age is very dumbed down crap, then when they get older, they're not really going to carry on that reading like other types of works, and even on the way of language, that they're not going to be exposed to a wide range of vocabulary in the English language. So that's, you know, and it does have a social effect, and I think we really have to come to grips with that.
Thanks, Martin.
I'd take on the publishing bit first. The Agatha Christie book, the commercial decision is to change the title of it because would it sell? And these are important decisions you make. Now, to keep it as a museum piece is something else, you know, that's a different issue. And the Roald Dahl thing you're mentioning, they've done both. They've kept the original Roald Dahls and come up with some altered Roald Dahls as well. So what you're saying about changes with amendments and then focusing on that, absolutely right. Perhaps do the same with, I don't know, Have you seen the Beano recently? My goodness. Anyway, but the Fawlty Towers thing that came up, the Dam Busters, other things like that. Stuart Home wrote. I'm going to swear in a minute, so prepare yourself. It's a trigger warning. Stuart Home wrote a book called Cunt. And in that book, you've got a sticker with the word cunt on it, and you can, it's blank on the spine, and you can either put cunt on there or not. It's up to you. Perhaps that's a way of dealing with it. You can have stickers with all these things there for you. In terms of, I think with schools, I think we're in a really interesting thing. When you've got schools which, have elected people looking after the schools and what goes on in the school. Even in that case, I think schools have a right, as they do in this country, that you must represent diversity of thought. Mm-hmm. And I think that is sacrosanct. Mm-hmm.
Okay, brilliant, thanks. On the censorship of the changing the books, I mean, you can also, I think probably the distinction is whether or you're changing the meaning of the book. I bought The Selfish Giant in a charity shop the other day, and there was a page left, and I was thinking, where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? He hasn't appeared yet. The whole thing is about Jesus, Oscar Wilde, and they just cut Jesus out of it, which seems to me, it's like you can't have The Selfish Giant without Jesus. Anyway, right, hands right at the back.
Yeah, so it just carries on from what you're just saying. What I love about books is you've read the same book as somebody in the past, me, and that shared experience is something that we're not really having these days. With Netflix and everything like that, we can all watch a series and nobody else has seen it and we can't talk about it. You know what I mean? And with a book, even one word can change the whole meaning of a whole book. You mean one description, and if that's like a racist term or whatever, it'll like hit you, and you want to hear that. You want to hear it in your head. Right? So just agreeing with the retroactive editing isn't actually just changing a book, it's changing your interaction with every other person who's ever read that book, or referred to it in a film, or use it as a touchstone of a social record.
Can I pick up on that point?
And also about the children's books, there's a growing movement online to discuss how children are getting really hyperactive because of these YouTube videos where it's just like developed in a lab to make kids hypnotized. And I think the children's books are kind of going the same way, where it's really basic, flip the page, not much going on really there. And also they're finding out that if you watch like Mary Poppins or something that's a bit more complicated, children calm down. And that's what a good book should be. Complicated and it makes the brain work properly.
Thank you, brilliant. Yes, yeah.
There's a plus point to this horrible hounding and cancellation, and there's not much of a plus point, but I've discovered lots of writers that I hadn't heard of. Seriously, I mean, I've ordered some of Jillian Philip's books that I haven't heard of. My children weren't at that age when you were publishing, so I found all these things. Christina Goucher, hadn't heard of her, brilliant writer. What's not to like? And I really think that independent publishers are the way forward, because the people who are too fit, I'm using that word advisedly, to publish and stand by their authors don't deserve to have sayings. And just a last thing, the protection that Salman Rushdie got was by a decision of somebody whose decision I don't normally agree with, Margaret Thatcher, and she took that decision to protect Salman Rushdie, and I think that was the right decision.
Brilliant, thanks. At the back there, yeah? Standing up, you. Yeah.
All right. I was going to say about the changing of the books, I don't agree with it, because to me that comes from a place of not trusting an artist to produce their own work that stands alone as it is good enough. Now, as an artist myself, I'd be really upset if somebody retrospectively changed a piece of my art to make it acceptable to somebody in 20 years' time that might have different ideas of how my art should look. I think it's good enough on its own and it's made how I want it to be with intention in the moment. So what's your justification, really, for changing the books if that is your idea?
Okay, brilliant, thank you, yes.
So I was going to address the question of what else could we do in this thing about independent publishers. I'm just going to say, don't forget the spirit of punk. So for musicians, for example, their works weren't commercial. They started their own record labels, and then, as you all know, punk, or you look at something like Spare Rib, again, something not commercial. So when I first listened to what you were all saying, it did sound like you were complaining about all these other people with power. Perhaps what you need is a kind of the literary equivalent of OnlyFans for writers.
Oh, steady on.
Yeah, so just like in a kind of similar note, so they like, let's say that the people who are the defenders of high culture, or kind of, the sophisticated people, are like a secret society almost, that we're in one of those moments in which, there's kind of a lot of the things that we would defend are submerged. It's nonetheless, really like those ideas will out, and so you've mentioned the punk example. You remember when we were all Marxists back in the day, and it was like, as a young person, it becomes really attractive when you find something which is utterly absorbing and oppositional. And so I think there's, there is always that moment, of course, for the power of really good work to be inspiring to a new generation. Very simple point.
Great. Then are we saying that then, like literary awards or official criticism then is sort of not worthless, but we just shouldn't be interested? We shouldn't be interested in the top 5 publishers. We shouldn't be interested in the Booker list. It doesn't, is there not any, as a writer, you want to have your work put out there, but also don't you want to have the most amount of people reading it? And so then there is, in the same way that I as a journalist want to get on the big programme so that I know everyone will tune in and more people will hear me, I'm also happy to do the little meeting in the back room of a pub. But are we just saying that there's no worth at all left to the officialdom of literature and publishing? All right, I think let me just take people who've not gone. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask, I'm not from the former Soviet Union, but I'm from Australia. So we have a completely different atmosphere there. I wanted to ask about AI, because when I started to just write a few articles in Australian publications, I was inspired by writers in The Guardian and those sort of things, because they're terrible. Some of them are just terrible writers. And I would read it and think, this is so bad. Really bad. And I think AI can replace those kind of articles very easily. So you're going to get, and I think you're seeing the decline of some of those small publications, political publications, because they don't need writers. They can just get AI in there. And I'm thinking, in this punk sort of vein, and yeah, there's the big publishing houses, but companies can go broke, right? A lot of big companies, Capital, can go broke because they're boring as shit. People are just going to say, I'm not going to buy it, well, hopefully. So I've got a little bit of faith in the human creative spirit, especially with AI taking things over, and we can hear, you can read things around, you can pick it up, and maybe it'll get better, maybe you won't be able to pick it up as much when it's AI generated. But I'm wondering what you think about that in terms of the new generation of AI coming through, replacing these boring as shit writers who are formulaic, they're the formula. You could get a 5-year-old trained to write Guardian writers. Maybe I'm being down.
I didn't, yeah. Certainly the spelling might be better in The Guardian if AI did. Any other contributions? Okay, yeah, go ahead again.
Can I ask about Bailey Gifford? Because that blew up this summer.
Yes. So anyone who's not familiar with it, Bailey Gifford sponsors a number of festivals, but in particular one literature festival had a sort of that thing that happens where one person on social media says that they have dropped out or object to it because of the sponsorship, because of links to or alleged links to Israel, and then it snowballs, and then eventually the literature festival itself announced that it was removing sponsorship in an incredibly ungrateful, as someone who organises events, I can't believe they did it way. But it led to, the snowballings led to the potential collapse of literature festivals, because it's hard to get funding these days to put on events, let me tell you. And so then you suddenly had some Guardian writers as well come out and say, maybe this is a problem, because it had affected their livelihoods. And, I suppose some of us took a decision rather to be mean and say, I told you so, to say, okay, welcome to the fold, are you now going to be a free speech person? We haven't had replies yet from them. Okay, panel, I've left you with a minute each. Let's do it in the order in which we began. Jenny.
All right. Okay. Well, Gillian just whispered in my ear, "Go for it, Jenny," about the Bailey Gifford thing. So I'll try and use that to fit into what I think about the limitations of punk, but also why you're right as well, to be honest, on some level. So Bailey Gifford were the sponsor of most of the literary festivals in Scotland, an organisation called Fossil Free Books, a lot of whom's writers have been involved in other literary houndings, took issue with them, and this has been growing for a little while, and eventually, even though the Edinburgh International Book Festival did not want to cave, and neither did Wigtown, Bailey Gifford were like, look, we really don't need this, you know, and so they pulled all their funding. Now, I only ran mid-scale events. Losing a sponsor of that type means I am pretty sure there's not going to be a kids programme at EIBF next year. It costs a fortune to put on literary festivals, and this is what I mean about the limitations of punk, right? Yes, for the grassroots. Yes, on your way up. Yes, if you've been cancelled, platform yourselves. If you are someone who's working class, if you're somebody who doesn't have money, if you're a woman with caring responsibilities, you need paid for your labour. Not everybody is in the position that I am in, where I can just sort of go, right, cool, Friday night venue, I'll platform myself. So we need other people platforming others as well. So we need like new networks. Yes, absolutely. That's where I agree with the punk thing. But there are limitations to it. And I think that in terms of the awards and things like that, and AI, actually, I think maybe good writers replacing these bad writers might be better. I don't know, rather than AI. And also, I don't think that, you know, good writers should be dispermitted, that's not a word, dispermitted from all the shiny baubles and the award money. Why? Never mind. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Brilliant.
And
thank you, Joe.
Okay, so very quickly, I'll just address that AI one, because just only a few weeks ago, I was at an event where the guy speaking was one of the most famous agents in the UK, hugely famous, hugely successful. And I asked him the AI question, and he came up with a great answer. And I don't like AI for lots of reasons, because I've worked in technology partly. But he said this, he said, you can guarantee right about now somebody's already written the AI novel, which will be published as though it's from a human being, and the story will be, goodness no, you didn't realise it's AI. He said that's already happened. You guarantee it's going to come out in the next few months. But his answer was, the next part of his answer was more interesting. He said, I think, you know, writers are creative people, and some creative people will find creative things to do with AI, and there will be some interesting products that come out of it. And I think he's probably right. You know, there are imaginative people who can use tools like that. Personally, I hate it, because most of my books are the kind of books that get stolen by AI.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Joe. Gillian.
Just going back very quickly to the commercialism aspect of it. First of all, publishing houses are not actually, as far as I don't have the figures or anything, but I don't think they're doing that well at the moment. And I think they're actually struggling a little bit. And first of all, I think publishing is not just, it shouldn't just be about commercial. I know all about big corporations, shareholders, all that stuff. But publishing, I think, has a particular responsibility as a home of creatives, and I don't think it should be entirely about commercialism. But the other thing is that I think it's not actually, they're not making commercial decisions, because what they're doing is listening to the loudest voices, and the loudest voices aren't actually the majority. They're listening to a tiny majority who are extremely noisy in social media, and a few kind of jealous or angry or whatever writers in their own ranks, and that's who they're listening to. And that's actually not commercial. That's kind of ruining for them. The other thing, the big five, when we were talking about, you want a big home for your book, you want the big marketing budget. The truth is that even if you're taken by a big five publisher, most writers are not getting that. You're getting an advance. You might get quite a good advance that you are never going to make back, so they will not go beyond your initial 2-book deal or whatever, because you have no way of making back your advance, because they're not going to concentrate in marketing. They publish far too much and they can't market them all. And they're publishing an awful lot of crap, as we've been saying. So it's not necessarily a good thing to be picked by a big five publisher. And I've been published by a big five publisher and the marketing was crap. And of course they didn't want anything past the first 2 books. because it's not said. So the big five are definitely not the be-all and end-all. And that's part of why independents are so important. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks. Ralph?
To pick up on just the last point, this is why somehow competition needs to be made for these big five publishers. After all, we live in a commercial capitalist economy. If there was substantial competition that took a big part of the money, then you'll see the conduct of their policy change very quickly. But I also want to say that, the life of a writer isn't easy. Very few actually get all that awards and all the money and all the grants that come with it. And we also tend to, romanticize the life of a writer. The idea of the writer who's drunk himself to death, and then you find the masterpiece in the drawer, or the USB stick. But at the same time, that dream is what a lot of writers go for. And we shouldn't live in a society where that dream somehow dies away, because it's through that dream that we get occasionally great books that transcend the ages.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Ralph. Martin?
So do I believe changes should be made to works of art, which if indeed that's what I think, and thank you for picking up on my own sort of struggle I'm having here, because I've found myself trying to agree with something I don't necessarily agree with, but I'm having a go. I'm a drama teacher by trade. In theatre changes art all the time. You change the writer's work for the audience of now, and that to me is an important part of art. Whether that means there shouldn't be a director's cut hanging around somewhere and then other works coming from that. But I do think the commercial thing, in the Agatha Christie case, you change the name of the title in order to sell it now, or you keep the title and it won't sell. So there's your choice there. Another way of illustrating it is in 1978, the film Great Rock and Roll Swindle. This is a punk thing coming in now. Sid Vicious is filmed walking through, with his swastikas all over him, walking through the Jewish quarter in Paris. Filmed there for edginess, to see the reactions. Do that today, how would that go down?
Brilliant. Can we thank our panel?